They saw their halls burned to the ground, their leaders dragged off, some never seen again. It was meant to break them. Instead, when the old order fell, they rose up, more united than ever before. This is Stories from the Co-op Evolution, a series about the people and principles that built a different kind of economy. Emilia Romagna sits in Italy's fertile north, stretching from the Apennine Mountains to the Adriatic coast. It's a region historically blessed and burdened by water. For centuries, the Great Po River and its many tributaries shaped everything about life here. Too little water meant parched fields and failed harvests. Too much, and the land drowned under floods. Managing this delicate balance wasn't optional, it was survival. So from medieval times onwards, communities in Emilia-Romagna learned to work together to tame their landscape. They dug canals, raised dikes, drained swampy lowlands, and reclaimed marshes, often across the boundaries of estates, villages, and even social classes. This was cooperation not born from ideology, but of necessity. Landowners, tenant farmers, sharecroppers, and day labourers all had a stake. If a canal failed or a dike broke, the consequences affected everybody, irrespective of class. In that sense, Emilia-Romagna's long history of managing water together planted the first seeds of what would become its extraordinary cooperative culture. It built habits of shared stewardship and interdependence even amid stark inequalities. Everyone relied on each other, because no single farm, family, or landlord could master the land alone. Long before modern cooperatives, Emilia-Romagna was dominated by a social and economic arrangement known as sharecropping. Under this system, tenant farmers, often entire extended families, worked plots of land owned by local elites. In return, they were required to hand over roughly half of their harvest as rent. They were also expected to perform additional services and lived under the social authority of the landlord, bound by customs that reinforced their subordinate place. Unlike absentee landlords in other parts of Europe, Emilia-Romagna's landowners were often directly involved in the running of their estates. They shared in expenses, helped oversee planting and harvest, and, at least in theory, offered protection to the families who farmed their land. This made the system deeply paternalistic, rooted in hierarchy and control, but also mutually binding. The landlord needed his tenants as much as they needed him. A failed crop hurt them both. Beyond these vertical ties of dependence, there was also a rich layer of horizontal mutualism among the peasants themselves. Sharecropping families exchanged labour at critical moments in the agricultural cycle, like sowing or harvest, so no one was left behind. They shared presses for olives, vats for wine, large tools too costly for any single family. Many lived clustered in fattori, small clusters of buildings that served as hubs of collective work and social life. It was an imperfect balance. Exploitation and deference to landlords were everyday realities. Yet this system also ingrained habits of collaboration and practical mutual aid, laying down social patterns that would outlast the sharecropping itself. In the cooperative spirit that would later define Emilia-Romagna, you can still see the faint echoes of these old sharecropping ties. Communities leaning on each other, not by utopian choice, but because their survival depended on it. By the early 1900s, the delicate balance of Emilia-Romagna's rural world began to unravel. A new breed of commercial leaseholders and industrial farmers emerged, fundamentally different from the traditional landlord elites. They had no interest in the old paternalistic responsibilities, the subtle give and take that bound landlords to sharecroppers. For them, land was purely an asset to maximize, and labour was a cost to be driven down. The rise of mechanization and expanding commodity markets accelerated this shift. Sharecropping contracts, once widespread, were increasingly replaced by wage labor arrangements. Instead of families with long-term ties to a plot of land and a landlord, there were now hired hands, paid by the day or season, with no claim to stability, no expectation that anyone would stand by them if times turned hard. This transition tore at the very fabric of rural life. The old system had been oppressive, yes, but it had also enforced a kind of shared risk and obligation. The new model was transactional, fragile, and wholly geared to the logic of profit. Peasants who once farmed as semi-stable sharecroppers found themselves landless labourers, drifting from estate to estate, with little security and even less dignity. In the social gaps left behind, the tradition of labour exchanges and shared facilities faded. Mutual dependence that once crossed class lines evaporated. What remained was a stark new landscape. Powerful landowners or commercial lease operators on one side, and an expanding pool of desperate landless workers on the other. That was the soil from which the conflict would grow. If the earlier world of canals and sharecropping had forged habits of practical cooperation, the rise of industrial agriculture laid the seeds for class confrontation, and for a new kind of mutualism that would not be based on patronage, but on collective self-assertion. By the first decades of the 20th century, the transformation of Emilia Romagna's countryside was impossible to ignore. Landless peasants pushed off traditional sharecropping plots or reduced to precocious day labour grew restless. Tenant farmers who still worked under old sharecropping contracts found themselves squeezed harder by commercial pressures, stripped of long-standing protections, and facing landlords less interested in mutual survival than in maximising returns. It was from this combustible mix that the region's rural class war erupted. Villages, once defined by uneasy cooperation across classes, now crackled with strikes, rent resistance, and direct confrontations. Tenant farmers now demanded not just better terms, but a total reordering of their relationship to landowners. No longer content with subservience, they wanted contracts that reflected real bargaining power, security, and dignity. Meanwhile, the truly landless peasants, those with nothing left to lose, became increasingly militant. They organised mass demonstrations, blocked estate roads, and sometimes seized harvests they believed were rightly theirs after years of exploitation. What gave this movement sharp edges and staying power was the rise of socialist federations, peasant leagues, and rural unions. Unlike today, where political allegiance often drifts from one party to the next with little structural leverage, these were deeply rooted organizations. Every day, activists moved from farm to farm, door to door, building associations that tied entire communities into disciplined networks of mutual support and shared political purpose. This was the ground-level power that would later allow cooperatives to spread so rapidly and endure so much. They weren't just commercial experiments. They were the institutional outgrowth of organized resistance, born from years of struggle in Emilia Romagna's fields. When the old sharecropping ties collapsed, rural workers didn't just drift apart. They organized unions, leagues, and early cooperatives to defend their livelihoods and negotiate on equal footing, no longer under the landlord's terms, but their own. As tenant farmers and landless labourers pushed for radical changes, landowners and local elites didn't just rely on courts or contracts to protect their interests. They backed violent squads who attacked union meetings, beat cooperative organisers, burned down offices, and in many cases carried out assassinations. These squads formed the backbone of Mussolini's early fascist movement. Fascism in Emilia-Romagna wasn't an abstract ideology. It was a direct tool to crush rural organising and protect landowner profits. Telegrams from the time show local officials pleading with the central government to intervene, describing entire towns paralysed by threats and violence. In Budrio, a local deputy reported that workers were locking themselves indoors for fear of beatings. Unions were forced to dissolve under threat of destruction, and the authorities stood by, unable or unwilling to act. When outright violence wasn't enough to eliminate the cooperatives, Mussolini shifted tactics. He created the Co-op Board of Control to bring cooperatives under fascist oversight. Leadership was replaced with loyalists. Independent federations were dissolved or folded into state-run bodies, and any link between co-ops and political organizing was systemically broken. But despite the repression, many cooperatives continued operating on an economic level, processing goods, maintaining local employment, and managing day-to-day survival. Underneath, networks of solidarity still existed, just out of open sight, waiting for a chance to reassert themselves. Even after Mussolini's regime brought cooperatives under official state oversight, the core economic functions of these co-ops didn't disappear. The regime needed them. They processed agricultural products, provided essential local credit, kept people employed, and sustained rural communities that the national economy couldn't afford to let collapse. But while the buildings stayed open and the machinery kept running, the democratic life of cooperatives was stripped away. Managers loyal to the regime replaced elected leaders. Cooperative federations that once helped small producers band together on their own terms were dissolved or absorbed into fascist structures. Any role the co-ops played as organizing centers for political or worker power was systemically dismantled. Still, the underlying habits of cooperation and mutual reliance didn't vanish. Families continued to support each other. Informal networks kept small acts of solidarity alive, and the memory of what cooperatives had once stood for stayed close to the surface. This meant that when the fascist system finally collapsed, cooperatives didn't have to be rebuilt from nothing. They still existed in form, waiting to be reclaimed in substance. When Mussolini's regime fell and the war ended, Emilia Romagna's rural class conflict didn't simply resolve. Landless peasants, many of whom had fought as partisans against fascism, returned determined not to go back to the old systems. They had been promised land, redistribution of large estates that would give them real ownership and security. But when these promises stalled, they took matters into their own hands. Between 1944 and 1949, organized groups of landless farmers began occupying estates across the region. These weren't small, spontaneous acts. They were often coordinated by unions and peasant leagues, planned village by village. They moved onto the land, started working it, and pressed local authorities to recognize their claims. Out of these occupations, more than 1,000 new agricultural cooperatives were formed, eventually involving around 250,000 members and managing roughly 150,000 hectares of land. At the same time, tenant farmers who hadn't lost everything under fascism used the moment to renegotiate their own conditions, demanding contracts that ended generations of subservience. Together, these movements fundamentally changed the structure of rural Emilia-Romagna, putting cooperative ownership and direct worker control at the center of local agriculture. The story of Emilia-Romagna's cooperatives didn't stop at local fields or village councils. After the war, as Italy rebuilt itself as a republic, the lessons of these struggles, of what cooperation had meant under both landlord rule and fascist control, shaped the new nation's founding laws. In 1947, when Italy drafted its new constitution, it made these lessons explicit. Article 45 recognizes the right of cooperative associations to exist, to remain free and independent democratic organizations, and to receive the recognition and support of the state. Article 46 guarantees workers the right to collaborate in managing their workplaces. Together, these weren't just economic statements, they enshrined cooperative structures as a pillar of Italy's new democracy. Most regions that started with strong cooperative movements eventually saw them hollowed out, bought up, demutualized, or broken under pressure from large-scale capital or global markets. Emilia Romagna didn't follow that pattern. By the 1980s and 1990s, even here, the political climate shifted. Neoliberal economic policies started to dominate Italy. Public money that once supported broad cooperative development was redirected mostly to individual firms. Important planning agencies like ERVET, which had helped coordinate cooperative growth across entire sectors, were scaled back or pushed towards purely commercial aims. But Emilia-Romagna's cooperative system didn't collapse under these pressures, for a few key reasons. Deep federations. By then, co-ops in the region had built strong second and third tier consortia. These networks pooled resources, spread risk, helped small co-ops compete for large contracts, and provided services that kept them viable even in tougher markets. Legal safeguards. Italian cooperative law enforced things like indivisible reserves, meaning wealth accumulated inside the cooperative couldn't simply be liquidated for private gain. That prevented quick sell-offs or conversions that weakened cooperatives elsewhere. The cooperatives of this region also had a culture of local embeddedness. Even private firms in Emilia-Romagna operated inside networks heavily influenced by cooperative norms, using cooperative banks, partnering with worker or producer co-ops, relying on local supply chains. That meant the whole regional economy was shaped by cooperative expectations, not just isolated enterprises. Because of all this, when neoliberal reforms came, Emilia-Romagna's cooperative ecosystem didn't vanish. It adjusted, merged, built stronger federations, and continued to anchor the local economy. Instead of being an alternative on the fringe, cooperation stayed central, even under global economic pressures that wiped out similar movements elsewhere. Fast forward to today, and Emilia-Romagna's cooperatives aren't side experiments or small-scale curiosities. They're at the heart of how the region works, socially, economically, and culturally. Cooperatives there play a central role in every major industry, from agriculture and food processing to construction, manufacturing, retail, banking, and social care. Roughly 1/3 of the region's GDP comes through cooperatives. In Bologna alone, close to 2 out of every 3 residents are members of a cooperative in some form, whether as worker owners, customers, or participants in social services. What makes Emilia-Romagna particularly striking is how even private capitalist firms operate inside an ecosystem shaped by cooperatives. They rely on cooperative banks for financing, subcontract to worker or producer co-ops, and often participate in regional supply chains and consortia where cooperative norms dominate. It flips the usual story. Rather than having a handful of co-ops trying to survive inside a capitalist market, here capitalist businesses adapt to function within a cooperative-led economy. This embedded structure also means wealth circulates locally. Profits that might otherwise flow out to distant shareholders stay within the region, supporting new businesses, funding local projects, and reinforcing the cooperative infrastructure that underpins Emilia-Romagna's resilience. The scale isn't limited to local life either. Many of these cooperatives have become international players. SACMI, for instance, exports high-tech ceramic production systems to more than 100 countries. CMC, the construction cooperative from Ravenna, runs projects across Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Together, they show that cooperation isn't just an alternative model tucked away in a corner. In Emilia-Romagna, it's the standard by which the economy operates: local, resilient, globally competitive, and deeply tied to community life. If you want to see what all this history means in practice, how these struggles, institutions, and principles still live on, then there's no better place than a general meeting of CMC in Ravenna. CMC is one of Italy's oldest and largest worker cooperatives, founded by unemployed bricklayers after World War I. Today, it's a massive construction cooperative with projects across continents. But each year, when they hold their annual general meeting, it feels less like a corporate event and more like a community gathering, a living testament to what cooperative identity really means here. The hall is filled with historic banners, photographs, and memorabilia that trace a century of struggle and achievement. Before business begins, they still read out their founding charter, grounding every decision in the principles that built the organization. What's really striking is who shows up. Not just the current worker owners, but people in their 80s and 90s who spent their lifetimes in the cooperative. Young children run between seats, future members who will inherit this tradition. Entire families attend together. It's a demographic cross-section of the region, with people treating the cooperative almost like an extension of their family or church, an institution that has given them stability and meaning across generations. It's a reminder that in Emilia Romagna, cooperatives aren't simply businesses, they're social and cultural institutions, woven into identity as much as livelihood. They stand as proof that it is possible to build an economy on principles of mutual support and local stewardship, capable of withstanding floods, fascism, global competition, and still come out stronger.